Good evening, curious minds. Tonight we dive deep into the most bizarre, the most invasive, and often the most terrifying sexual practices of the medieval world, a period often shrouded in romantic myths of chivalry and courtly love, yet in reality, far stranger, more complex, and frankly, more disturbing than any storybook. Close your eyes for a moment and imagine yourself stepping back in time, not into a fairy tale, but into the gritty, unvarnished reality of the 14th century. You're tramping through muddy, winding streets. The air is thick with the pervasive smells of wood smoke, damp earth, livestock, and something distinctly less savory from the gutters. You hear the clang of the blacksmith's hammer, the distant bleating of sheep, the raucous chatter of merchants hawking their wares in a bustling marketplace. Timber-framed houses lean precariously over the narrow lanes, casting long, somber shadows. But beneath this seemingly rustic and pious exterior, hidden within the ancient stones of castles, the hushed sanctity of cathedrals, and even the simple hovels of peasants, lay a labyrinthine world of desire, societal taboos, and astonishingly peculiar habits that would make your modern sensibilities do a profound double take, perhaps even a triple take, followed by a cold shower. Fair warning, you probably won't survive this journey with your innocent notions of the past entirely intact. But frankly, that's where the true adventure begins, isn't it? So, before you get too comfortable and drift off into dreams of knights and ladies, take a quick moment to like the video and subscribe. But remember, only if you genuinely enjoy peeling back the layers of sanitized history and confronting the raw, uncomfortable, yet utterly fascinating truths of our ancestors. And as always, drop a comment below and let me know where you're tuning in from tonight and what time it is for you. Now, dim the lights, perhaps pour yourself a strong modern drink, you'll need it, and let's unlock the hidden chambers of medieval sexuality. The nightmare of fitness trials, your intimacy on public display. You think medieval people were sexually repressed prudes who did it through a hole in a sheet? Prepare for a brutal awakening. In the medieval world, especially from the 12th century onwards, if you were a man seeking an annulment of your marriage, or a woman accusing your husband of non-consummation, your most intimate capabilities became courtroom evidence. You'd wake up not to a private conversation with a lawyer, but to judges or ecclesiastical courts, demanding incredibly intimate, humiliating, and public medical examinations to verify your sexual fitness for marriage. This wasn't a discreet doctor's visit. This was a spectacle. Imagine this: a husband, perhaps tired of his wife, or facing pressure from his family to produce an heir, claims he can't consummate the marriage. He might genuinely be impotent due to illness, injury, or psychological stress. Or he might be feigning it to escape an unwanted union. Or a wife desperate for freedom from a cruel union, or perhaps feeling genuinely unfulfilled, alleges her husband is impotent. The court, particularly the ecclesiastical courts, which held immense power over marriage, wouldn't just take their word for it. Oh no, they would order a congress, or a proof of congress. This meant the couple would be forced to attempt intercourse in the presence of witnesses. Yes, you heard that right. This could involve an assembly of court officials, usually older women or experienced matrons, often described as wise women, or midwives who were thought to have an expert, practical understanding of the body, sometimes even male judges or clerics, discreetly observing through a crack in a door, listening intently to the sounds of struggle or success. The purpose was to verify that the man could achieve an erection and penetration, and that the woman was receptive and had not falsely accused him. This ritualistic performance, often lasting for several nights, was intended to prove or disprove impotence or frigidity. If the man failed to perform despite multiple attempts over the course of days or even weeks, he could be declared permanently impotent and the marriage annulled. This annulment, unlike a divorce, meant the marriage was considered null and void from the beginning, as if it had never happened, allowing both parties to remarry within the church. The humiliation, the psychological pressure, the sheer indignity of being forced to perform under such an invasive public gaze is almost incomprehensible to the modern mind. Your personal capabilities, your most private act, became courtroom evidence, subject to the scrutiny and judgment of strangers, determining your entire social and marital future. A failed examination could cost you your marriage, your social standing, your reputation, and sometimes even your property rights, leaving you utterly shamed and destitute. For men, being declared impotent was a profound emasculation in a society that valued virility and the production of heirs above almost all else. For women, falsely accusing a man could lead to severe social ostracism or accusations of slander. This was not a quick, sterile medical test. It was a deeply personal, drawn-out ordeal designed to extract truth, no matter the psychological cost. Beyond this, there were often physical examinations. For men, this could involve a test of virility, where midwives or other designated women would physically examine the man's genitalia to assess if there were any obvious physical impediments to intercourse, or even to test for responsiveness. For women, it could be even more invasive, with a physical examination to determine if there were any physical barriers to consummation, or to look for signs of previous sexual activity. These weren't clinical, objective medical assessments. They were often based on visual inspection, touch, and the subjective judgment of those conducting them, infused with medieval anatomical beliefs that were often wildly inaccurate and based on superstition as much as observation. The sheer lack of privacy, the public nature of these deeply personal matters, demonstrates a medieval mindset profoundly different from our own, where individual autonomy and the sanctity of private life were concepts that simply did not exist in the same way. The Church's power to intervene in such intimate matters underscored its immense authority over every aspect of medieval life, from the spiritual to the most carnal. Ceremonial verification, when consummation required an audience of nobles and neighbors. Following on from the fitness trials, the act of marriage consummation itself, far from being a private, intimate moment between two individuals, was often a semi-public, even ceremonial event. While not every peasant couple had witnesses in the bedchamber, it was remarkably common among the nobility and gentry, and even in some peasant communities, for the act to be observed or its completion publicly verified. The bedchamber, particularly for high-status marriages, was not always a sanctuary of privacy. In some traditions, guests, often family members, close friends, or high-ranking witnesses, sometimes even the parents of the bride and groom, would physically accompany the newlyweds to the marriage bed. They would put the couple to bed, a ritual that could involve stripping them down, offering them drinks, often wine or ale to calm nerves or encourage performance, making crude jokes and encouragements, and even physically placing them into the bed. This was done to ensure the marriage was truly consummated, thereby making it legally binding and ensuring the legitimacy of any future heirs. The bedding ceremony could be a boisterous procession from the wedding feast to the bedchamber. Guests, often drunk on ale or wine, would sing bawdy songs, make crude jokes, and beat pots and pans outside the door or even within the room itself. They wouldn't leave until they heard proof of consummation, sounds that indicated the act had taken place. This was particularly crucial in royal or noble marriages, where the succession of a kingdom or a noble house depended on indisputable proof of a valid union. Accounts from various European courts describe this custom in detail, sometimes even involving the sheet being inspected for signs of virginity or consummation the next morning, especially if the bride's virginity was in question. Imagine the pressure, the sheer awkwardness, the terror of performing your most intimate act while a crowd of revelers, family, and even strangers waited impatiently, loudly, outside or inside your door for auditory confirmation. For the young bride, perhaps barely 15 winters old, like our Margot, standing nervously in her shift, the palpable expectation, fueled by the rowdy crowd outside, would have been terrifying and deeply humiliating. It wasn't about love or desire, it was about dynastic, social, and economic legitimacy, ensuring that the contractual agreement of marriage had been fulfilled. This public expectation and verification of consummation stripped away any semblance of privacy, transforming a deeply personal act into a public, legally significant, and often embarrassing ritual, demonstrating how marriage was fundamentally a social and economic contract first, and a personal union second. The collective community had a vested interest in the validity of a marriage, especially in terms of property, inheritance, and social order. Bishops as entertainment moguls, the church's unexpected role in pleasure. You might picture the medieval church as a bastion of strict moral purity, condemning all forms of worldly pleasure and sinful behavior. And while it certainly preached asceticism and moral rectitude, the reality was far more complex and frankly astonishing. Many bishops and monastic orders, particularly in larger towns and cities, became significant landowners and economic powerhouses. Their vast land holdings and extensive property portfolios generated considerable income, and as part of these diverse revenue streams, they owned and managed an array of businesses that we would consider profoundly unchristian today. This often included taverns, breweries, producing the ubiquitous ale consumed by all, and even brothels and bathhouses, which frequently served as fronts for or directly facilitated prostitution. Yes, you heard that right. Some medieval bishops essentially ran entertainment empires, deriving considerable income from establishments that facilitated what they publicly condemned as sin. These church-owned brothels and taverns were not hidden away in dark corners. They were often strategically located near important pilgrimage routes, bustling market squares, or even directly adjacent to cathedrals and other prominent religious sites. For instance, the infamous Stews brothels of Southwark in London were for centuries under the jurisdiction of the Bishop of Winchester, who licensed them, profited from their activities, and even set rules for the prostitutes working there. This was not an isolated incident. Similar arrangements existed in other European cities. They were a consistent source of steady income for the church, demonstrating a pragmatic or hypocritical approach to morality, where financial gain often superseded strict religious doctrine. The official argument, a fascinating piece of medieval moral casuistry, was often that these establishments served a necessary social function. By allowing and regulating them, the church argued it was controlling and containing vice, preventing it from proliferating unchecked on the streets, and providing a safe, relative to the incredibly dangerous streets, space for travelers, merchants, and even local citizens to indulge in worldly pleasures away from respectable society. Imagine the profound cognitive dissonance, a bishop sermonizing eloquently about the evils of lust and drunkenness on Sunday from the pulpit of his magnificent cathedral, while throughout the week he was directly profiting from those very activities through rents and taxes levied on his own properties. This reveals a fascinating, often contradictory aspect of medieval society, where the sacred and the profane were far more intertwined than we might assume, and where economic realities often dictated moral compromises at the highest levels of spiritual authority. It challenges our simplistic notions of medieval piety and reveals a complex world where religious authority was deeply embedded in the secular economy, even in its most sinful aspects, demonstrating a surprising blend of spiritual aspiration and earthly opportunism. Medical prescriptions for intimate satisfaction, doctors and the wandering womb. Medieval medicine, as we've already discussed in previous journeys, was a strange and often terrifying beast, a blend of ancient theories, folk remedies, and superstitious beliefs. But its understanding of female sexual health and desire was particularly peculiar, and from a modern perspective, quite shocking. Far from being seen as solely a moral or spiritual issue to be suppressed, intimate satisfaction, particularly for women, was often considered a vital component of physical health. Medieval doctors, drawing heavily from ancient Greek medical theories, especially those of Hippocrates and Galen, interpreted through a medieval lens, believed in the concept of the wandering womb, or suffocation of the mother, Latin hysteria. It was thought that if a woman's uterus did not receive adequate stimulation, if it became dry or unfed due to lack of sexual activity, or if it was filled with excess humors, it would literally wander throughout her body. This displaced uterus, they believed, would then press against other organs, causing a myriad of seemingly unrelated and debilitating ailments: shortness of breath, a suffocating sensation, hence suffocation of the mother, anxiety, fainting spells, convulsions, insomnia, extreme irritability, melancholia, and a host of other debilitating physical and psychological symptoms. The prescribed cure for this wandering womb, often ironically, it was explicitly marital intercourse. Physicians would advise husbands to engage regularly and consistently with their wives to keep the womb moist, nourished, and content in its proper place within the pelvis. This was not presented as an act of pleasure, but as a necessary medical treatment to prevent the woman's serious illness and restore her health. In cases where the husband was absent, e.g. away at war, on pilgrimage, or simply unavailable, or was incapable due to impotence or illness, or if a woman was unmarried and experiencing these symptoms, medieval doctors sometimes performed pelvic massages, which were essentially manual stimulation of the clitoris to orgasm to relieve the symptoms. These procedures were not seen as illicit or pleasurable acts in themselves by the medical establishment, but as necessary, almost clinical, medical interventions to restore a woman's health and prevent her womb from literally suffocating her. This reveals a profoundly different medical understanding of the female body and sexuality, one that viewed female desire and satisfaction not as a sin to be suppressed or a purely spiritual concern, but as a physiological necessity for well-being. It highlights the strange intersection of medical theory, social norms, and practical solutions in an age devoid of modern anatomical or physiological understanding, where the concept of the female orgasm was tied to health maintenance rather than personal pleasure. The underlying belief was that the human body needed to be balanced, and for women, sexual release was considered a crucial part of that humoral balance. Deadly contraception, risking life for fertility control. In a world where large families were common, infant mortality was rampant, and women spent most of their adult lives pregnant or nursing, often birthing 10-15 children, with only a few surviving to adulthood. The desire for fertility control was undoubtedly present and often desperate, even if explicitly condemned by the Church as a mortal sin. However, without modern scientific understanding, medieval contraceptive methods were often bizarre, ineffective, and terrifyingly dangerous, frequently risking the woman's life or causing severe debilitating illness. Beyond coitus interruptus withdrawal, which was the safest but often unreliable method, and complete abstinence, which was impractical for married couples and often impossible for others, women resorted to a wide array of folk remedies, magical charms, and rudimentary herbal concoctions. These methods ranged from the relatively harmless and utterly useless to the truly deadly and agonizing. Some women would wear amulets made from animal testicles, like those of a weasel or a mule, or a piece of a freshly killed animal's liver, or even the earwax of a mule, believing these could magically prevent conception. Others would carry crushed herbs, specific stones, or even portions of a hanged man's body, believed to possess potent, if dark, magic, in pouches, hoping for magical protection against pregnancy. More dangerously, women would ingest various concoctions of herbs, often with abortifacient, abortion-inducing, or contraceptive properties. These potions could include ingredients like pennyroyal, savin, rue, tansy, or black hellebore. While some of these herbs did indeed have pharmacological effects, sometimes capable of inducing uterine contractions or causing menstrual flow, their dosages were uncontrolled, and their preparation was unscientific, often based on ancient texts or local folklore. Many of them were highly toxic, causing severe and agonizing side effects like violent vomiting, crippling abdominal cramps, debilitating diarrhea, painful convulsions, internal bleeding, kidney failure, liver damage, and often agonizing death for the woman in her desperate attempt to control her fertility. The risk was enormous, but for women trapped in a relentless cycle of constant pregnancy, with the ever-present threat of childbirth mortality, or simply facing too many mouths to feed in a time of precarious food supply, the desperation drove them to these extreme and perilous measures. This grim reality highlights the severe lack of reproductive autonomy, the immense physical and emotional toll of constant childbearing, and the desperate and dangerous measures women were forced to take in a society that offered them no safe or effective options for family planning, forcing them to gamble with their lives. The curious case of the groomsman's proof, ensuring consummation and preventing witchcraft. Beyond the judicial inquiries and public betting ceremonies, some medieval communities had even more localized and peculiar customs to ensure the validity of a marriage, often tied to deep-seated fears of witchcraft, demonic interference, and male impotence. In some rural areas, particularly in parts of Germany, France, and even England, there was a custom where the groomsmen, friends or male relatives of the groom, would perform a ritual to help the couple consummate their marriage. This wasn't just about revelry or making crude jokes. It was about ensuring that no magical impediment, such as a nodding charm, maleficium legaminis cast by a jealous witch, a disgruntled rival, or an envious neighbor, prevented the groom from performing his marital duties. The belief was that such a charm could magically bind the groom's sexual capabilities, making him temporarily or permanently impotent, or rendering the couple unable to conceive. This could involve the groomsman physically entering the bedchamber after the couple had retired and performing various acts to break the spell. This might include beating pots and pans even louder than during the procession, shouting specific incantations or blessings, making loud noises, or most bizarrely and invasively, physically helping the groom to achieve his goal. Some historical accounts and folk traditions describe groomsmen holding down the bride, or even physically holding the groom in place, ensuring penetration occurred. The intention was to counter any magical forces that might be causing temporary impotence, to literally untie the knot of the spell. While these acts might have provided a crude psychological boost, a bizarre distraction, or simply added to the already immense pressure. They were undeniably a grotesque invasion of privacy and a testament to the pervasive, almost paranoid, fear of magic and its malevolent influence on human fertility and desire. The pressure on the groom to perform, not just for his bride, but for the watchful, superstitious, and often boisterous community, was immense, as his failure could lead to profound shame, an annulment or suspicion of demonic influence. This practice illustrates the deep intertwining of superstition, social pressure, and marital obligation in the medieval mindset, where personal intimacy was constantly under the scrutiny of both divine and magical forces, and where a man's virility was not just a personal matter, but a community concern for the perpetuation of family lines and the avoidance of dark magic. Love potions and black magic, desperate measures for affection and fertility. In a world steeped in superstition and limited scientific understanding, where life was often precarious and unpredictable, it's perhaps unsurprising that people turned to magic for matters of the heart and body. Love potions and charms were widely believed to exist and were desperately sought after, often with terrifying and gruesome ingredients. These weren't the sweet, fragrant elixirs of fairy tales. They were often disgusting, dangerous concoctions believed to compel love, restore lost affection, or guarantee fertility. Ingredients for these magical aids could be incredibly disturbing and unsettling, reflecting a belief in sympathetic magic, that like affects like. They could include human bodily fluids like blood, menstrual, animal, or even a lover's own, surreptitiously obtained, semen, urine, hair, fingernail clippings, or even more morbid ingredients, such as portions of corpses, especially from unbaptized infants or executed criminals, believed to hold dark power, parts of animals like bats, toads, or snakes, or grave dirt. These would be mixed with various herbs, some with genuine, albeit unscientific effects, others purely symbolic, animal organs, strange minerals or powders, and then secretly ingested by the intended victim, applied topically to their skin or belongings, or placed under a bed or threshold. For instance, some recipes for a love charm involved grinding up the heart of a dove with powdered human bones and secretly placing it in the intended lover's food or drink. Another charm involved a woman carrying the severed ear of a wolf to ensure her husband's fidelity, or burying a lock of her hair and her lover's in a specific spot at a crossroads. The belief was that the powerful, visceral connection of these ingredients would magically bind the desired person's affections, make them fall uncontrollably in love, or ensure conception if fertility was the goal. Beyond love, desperate couples also sought magical solutions for fertility, particularly if a woman was struggling to conceive, or if a man was believed to be infertile. Charms and rituals for fertility often involved animal sacrifices, often to pre-Christian deities or spirits, specific prayers to saints, sometimes very obscure ones, believed to specialize in fertility, or even more bizarre practices like burying a woman's shift in a freshly plowed field to encourage fruitfulness, or having sexual intercourse in a field during a specific moon phase. The irony, of course, is that these potions and charms were often unsanitary, unhygienic, and outright poisonous, made from toxic plants or decaying matter, far more likely to cause severe illness, disfigurement, or even agonizing death than genuine affection or conception. This obsession with love magic and fertility charms highlights the desperate human desire for control over their emotional and reproductive lives in an era where they felt utterly powerless against fate, disease, social pressures, and the unpredictable nature of love and procreation. It also shows how deeply magic, Superstition and religion were interwoven into the fabric of daily life, including its most intimate aspects, serving as a desperate last resort when all other avenues failed. The Church's sexual prohibitions, a labyrinth of sin. While we've seen the Church's surprising pragmatism and even direct financial involvement in some areas, like the bishop-owned brothels, its official doctrinal stance on sexual morality was incredibly strict and comprehensive, creating a labyrinth of prohibitions that governed almost every conceivable intimate act. For medieval Christians, especially after the Gregorian reforms of the 11th century, which sought to standardize doctrine and practice across Europe, sex was primarily and almost exclusively for procreation within the confines of sanctified, sacramental marriage. Any sexual act that deviated from this singular purpose or occurred outside of marriage was deemed a grave sin, ranging from venial to mortal, depending on its nature. The concept of sodomy was incredibly broad and terrifyingly vague, encompassing not just same-sex relations, but also any non-procreative sexual acts between married heterosexual couples, such as oral sex, anal sex, or even certain unnatural positions that were considered to impede conception or simply bring too much unnatural pleasure. Masturbation was a grave sin, as was any form of contraception, abortion, or bestiality. Even marital relations themselves were heavily regulated. Certain times of the year were explicitly forbidden for marital intercourse. The entirety of Lent, a period of 40 days of fasting and penance before Easter, Advent, the 4 weeks before Christmas, every Sunday, every Wednesday and Friday, as days of fasting or penance, all major feast days, of which there were many, and often the days leading up to and after receiving communion. These prohibitions, when added up, could easily amount to over half the days in a year, during which married couples were theoretically forbidden from having sex. Engaging in sex during these forbidden periods was considered a mortal sin, requiring confession and penance to avoid eternal damnation. Confessors, particularly after the Fourth Lateran Council in 1215, mandated annual confession, would routinely ask parishioners incredibly detailed and invasive questions about their sexual practices to uncover these sins, creating an intense atmosphere of guilt, anxiety, and moral surveillance. The result was a populace living under immense psychological pressure, constantly aware of the potential for sin in their most private moments. People were taught to fear eternal damnation for acts that today are considered normal, consensual parts of intimacy within a committed relationship. This rigid moral framework, combined with the lack of privacy in communal living, meant that the internal lives of medieval individuals were deeply shaped by an omnipresent fear of divine punishment and severe social condemnation for their natural desires. The Church's extensive penitentials, books for confessors detailing sins and their prescribed penances, laid out these rules in excruciating detail, turning every intimate act into a potential moral minefield, with a complex hierarchy of sins and corresponding spiritual punishments, creating an intense, almost claustrophobic, moral landscape for medieval sexuality. The leash of shame, public humiliation for adultery. Adultery was, and largely still is, considered a serious breach of marital vows and a transgression against social order. But in the medieval period, particularly for women, the punishment could be incredibly public, humiliating and physically brutal, designed not just to punish the individual, but to serve as a terrifying deterrent to the entire community. While men were often given more leeway due to patriarchal societal structures and the lesser impact on legitimate lineage, an adulterous woman could face severe social, legal, and physical repercussions. In some communities, especially those with strong local traditions and a fierce emphasis on female chastity and male honor, the adulterous woman was subjected to a leash of shame or a public parade of degradation. Imagine this: a woman accused, tried, and convicted of adultery might be stripped naked or nearly naked, perhaps clad only in a shift, and then led through the streets of her village or town by a rope tied around her waist or neck. She would be paraded as a public spectacle, a living example of moral failure, subjected to the jeers, insults, and physical assaults of the community. People might throw rotten food, mud, animal dung, or even stones at her, spitting and shouting condemnations. This act was not merely symbolic. It was designed to inflict maximum public humiliation and shaming, physically marking her as an outcast and a moral transgressor. The procession would continue until she was driven out of town, often banished permanently from her home and family, or subjected to further, perhaps even more severe, corporal punishment or mutilation. The goal was to destroy her reputation entirely, making it virtually impossible for her to reintegrate into society. This also served as a stark warning to others and reinforced the patriarchal social order, where female fidelity was paramount to ensure legitimate heirs and maintain the social fabric. This public shaming illustrates the extreme lack of privacy surrounding intimate matters and the brutal ways in which medieval society enforced moral codes, especially on women. The concept of rehabilitation was minimal. Punishment was about public spectacle, deterrence, and the restoration of perceived social order, often through the degradation of the individual. This horrifying practice stands in stark contrast to modern legal systems, where such public degradation would be unthinkable and illegal, demonstrating how deeply ingrained societal control was over individual sexuality, particularly female sexuality, and the lengths to which communities would go to enforce moral conformity, often with severe physical and psychological consequences for the transgressor. The public nature of the punishment meant that the shame would be etched into the collective memory of the community, serving as a constant reminder of the consequences of deviation. The bizarre treatment of venereal diseases, superstition, mercury, and agony. Sexually transmitted infections, STIs, were undoubtedly present in the medieval period, though their causes and treatments were, of course, entirely misunderstood. While syphilis, in its virulent European form, burst onto the scene in the late 15th century, often called the Great Pox or French disease, other less virulent STIs like gonorrhea and chlamydia likely existed throughout the earlier medieval period, causing various unpleasant symptoms that baffled physicians. The medieval approach to venereal disease was a terrifying blend of superstition, primitive medicine, and brutal, often fatal treatments that caused immense suffering. Without germ theory, medieval doctors and the general populace attributed STIs to a range of causes: divine punishment for sin, especially lust, astrological influences, misalignment of planets, bad humors, an imbalance in the body's 4 vital fluids, or even the malevolent stare or curse of a witch. The symptoms, such as painful genital sores, changers, rashes, ulcers, skin lesions, discharge, and systemic fevers, were horrifyingly visible and debilitating, leading to profound social ostracism and intense fear, as they were seen as a physical manifestation of moral depravity. Treatment often involved agonizing and highly toxic remedies. Mercury, known for its powerful antiseptic properties, though its extreme toxicity to humans was not understood, was a common cure for syphilis once it appeared, and likely for other skin conditions. Patients would undergo various forms of mercury treatment. Mercury rubs, applying mercury ointments directly to the sores or skin, ingesting mercury compounds, often in liquid form, or even sitting in mercury vapor baths, where heated mercury produced toxic fumes that were inhaled or absorbed through the skin. These treatments often caused severe and horrifying side effects, including acute neurological damage, tremors, madness, paralysis, severe mouth ulcers, loss of teeth, organ failure, kidney, liver, and ultimately an agonizing death from mercury poisoning, often long before the underlying disease itself would prove fatal. The cure was often worse than the disease. Other treatments included vigorous bloodletting to drain infected humors, purging induced vomiting or violent diarrhea to expel toxins, various herbal poultices, some with a slight antiseptic effect, like those containing moldy bread, others purely symbolic and useless, and bizarre rituals involving prayers, charms, or even touching the sores of an animal believed to possess healing properties. The agony of the symptoms, the public shame of the visible lesions, and the often fatal cures made venereal disease a truly terrifying ordeal in the medieval world. It highlights the profound suffering caused by a lack of scientific understanding and effective medicine in an era where intimate acts carried extreme, often deadly risks beyond just unwanted pregnancy, turning a curable disease into a slow, public, and agonizing descent into madness and death. The social stigma attached to these diseases, often seen as a direct judgment from God for sinful behavior, only compounded the suffering of those afflicted. Nudity and modesty, a shifting and contradictory landscape. Modern notions of nudity and modesty are highly influenced by a blend of Judeo-Christian traditions and perhaps more strongly by the Victorian-era sensibilities of the 19th century, which equated exposed skin with moral depravity. The medieval period, however, had a more complex and often contradictory relationship with the naked body, one that might surprise you and challenge your assumptions. While the church certainly preached modesty, condemned unchaste displays, and associated nudity with sin, Adam and Eve's fall, the shame of the body, everyday life often necessitated a degree of nudity or lack of strict privacy that would be deeply unsettling to modern sensibilities. Peasants and common folk often slept naked or in simple shifts, long loose undergarments, sometimes communally with family members or even servants sharing beds due to poverty, the need for warmth, and the sheer lack of space for individual beds. Bathing, when it occurred, which was rarely a full-body wash for most, as discussed previously, was often in communal bathhouses where men and women might mix, or in rivers and streams with little regard for strict gender segregation or privacy. These bathhouses, as noted, also served as social hubs and often centers for prostitution. Public display of punishment, like the leash of shame for adulterers or the exposure in the stocks, involved nudity or semi-nudity as a tool of humiliation and social degradation, designed to strip the individual of their dignity along with their clothes. Even in medical examinations for marriage or fertility, or for surgical procedures, nudity was a practical necessity, as previously mentioned, with no sense of clinical discretion. However, depictions of nudity in art, particularly religious art, were often symbolic rather than erotic, representing the vulnerability of the soul, the fallen state of humanity, Adam and Eve, martyrdom, or the resurrection of the dead. While there were certainly erotic undertones in some secular art, marginalia in manuscripts and literature, often satirizing the church or courtly love or explicitly lewd poetry, the prevailing public moral code was theoretically one of modesty and the covering of the body. The contradiction lay in the practical realities of life. Poverty, communal living, lack of sanitation, and primitive medical practices, which often forced a lack of personal modesty that was at odds with the church's spiritual ideal. This created a fascinating tension between spiritual ideals and the earthy, often uncomfortable, realities of medieval life, where the body was both a vessel for the soul and a source of constant temptation, practical challenges, and unavoidable exposure. It highlights that modesty, like many other social constructs, is highly culturally and historically relative, and our ancestors had a very different, often much more open, relationship with the bare human form out of sheer necessity. The two-seed theory and reproductive confusion of medieval understanding of human reproduction was incredibly rudimentary and often based on ancient Greek ideas, particularly the two-seed theory, derived primarily from Aristotle's biological writings, heavily influenced by Galen's medical texts, and filtered through Arab and then Latin translations. This theory, which was widely accepted, posited that both men and women produced seed that combined to form a fetus. The male seed was considered more active, hotter, and more dominant, providing the form or essence of the child, determining its characteristics. The female seed, on the other hand, was considered more passive, cooler, and provided the matter or substance, contributing to the physical substance of the child. This contrasted with earlier one-seed theories, like Hippocrates's, which suggested both parents produce seed, but without the strict active/passive dichotomy, or even Plato's, where only the male produced seed and the woman was merely an incubator. While seemingly scientific for its time, this theory led to a lot of confusion and strange beliefs about conception, infertility, and even gender determination. For instance, it was believed that the quality, quantity, and hotness of the seeds, and even the side of the womb where the seeds combined, could determine the sex of the child. A hotter male seed and a hotter womb were believed to produce a boy, while a cooler combination would produce a girl. If a couple failed to conceive, blame could be placed on either partner's seed being weak, insufficient, too cold, or otherwise infertile. This influenced medical interventions, like prescribing certain foods or activities to heat up the seed, and even legal judgments in cases of barrenness or disputed paternity. It also had significant implications for how children were understood to inherit traits and how legitimacy was defined within family lines. The complete lack of understanding about ovulation, the specific role of the egg, which was not truly discovered until much later, the exact mechanics of fertilization, and the microscopic processes of cell division meant that the entire process of human reproduction was shrouded in profound mystery, leading to a reliance on superstition, prayer, magical charms as discussed, and the often bizarre medical cures for infertility. This fundamentally flawed understanding of human biology shaped how people approached intimacy, fertility, family planning, and the societal pressures related to procreation in a profound way, adding another layer of uncertainty, anxiety, and desperation to an already precarious existence. It further underscored the pervasive belief that supernatural or humoral forces, rather than biological mechanisms, were the primary drivers of reproductive success or failure. The celibacy of the clergy, ideal versus reality. While the ideal of clerical celibacy became increasingly enforced by the Church, particularly after the Gregorian reforms of the 11th century, which aimed to purify the clergy and separate them from worldly affairs, the reality on the ground was often far more complex and riddled with blatant contradictions. Despite official prohibitions and severe penalties, many priests, monks, and nuns struggled with or simply ignored their vows of celibacy, leading to a constant, often scandalous, tension between church doctrine and deeply ingrained human nature. Parish priests, particularly in rural areas where oversight was lax and communities were more isolated, often had concubines or unofficial wives, often referred to euphemistically as housekeepers or nieces, and many children were openly born to clergy members. These relationships were frequently tolerated by the local populace, who preferred a priest with a family who understood their worldly concerns, and sometimes even by local bishops, who might overlook these violations for a variety of reasons, including practical necessity, lack of celibate priests, personal gain, bribes, or simply because they too were violating their vows. Monasteries and convents, while theoretically places of strict piety, asceticism, and isolation, were not immune to human desire, and historical records are rife with stories of illicit affairs, secret children, and even brothels connected to monastic properties, or monks and nuns engaging in sexual escapades beyond their cloistered walls. While some of these accounts were undoubtedly exaggerated by reformers or critics of the church, they point to a very real and widespread struggle to maintain the celibate ideal. The church's persistent, centuries-long efforts to enforce celibacy through numerous councils, synods, decrees, threats of excommunication, and public shaming campaigns highlight the pervasive nature of these violations. It reveals a profound societal hypocrisy where the spiritual leaders preached one thing but often practiced another, creating a massive gulf between the idealized moral code and the lived reality of medieval clergy. This tension between the sacred ideal of celibacy and the profane reality of clerical sexuality was a constant source of scandal, popular satire, often depicting lecherous monks or priests, and fervent moral debate in the medieval period, revealing that even within the heart of the church, human sexual drives were a powerful, often uncontrollable force that defied easy suppression by ecclesiastical law. This widespread clerical non-celibacy also had significant implications for church property, inheritance, and the very perception of clerical authority among the laity. Marriage and economic survival, a transaction, not a romance. While the sophisticated, high-flown courtly love poetry and chivalric romances of the High Middle Ages might speak of idealized, often unrequited romantic devotion between a knight and a noble lady, for the vast majority of medieval people, marriage was overwhelmingly an economic, social, and political transaction, not a matter of romantic love or personal attraction. You would not choose your spouse based on shared interests, deep affection, or emotional compatibility. Your parents, guardians, or feudal lords would choose for you based on land, property, social status, and strategic alliances. For peasants, marriage was fundamentally about securing labor, consolidating small fragmented landholdings, or simply ensuring basic survival and the continuation of the family line. A marriage meant more hands for the arduous farm work, a stronger, more resilient family unit, and a way to pass on property, however meager, to the next generation. It was a practical necessity. For nobles, it was about political alliances, securing power, expanding territory, consolidating wealth through dowries and inheritance, and elevating family status. A substantial dowry could elevate a family's social standing, and a strategically chosen marriage could prevent wars, forge powerful new alliances, or strengthen dynastic claims. The emotional connection between spouses, if it developed at all over the years, was a secondary consideration, a pleasant bonus, rather than a prerequisite for the union. Young people, like our Margot, were often married off at incredibly young ages, girls often as young as 12. boys around 14 or 16, with little to no say in the matter. These child marriages were designed to secure alliances early and ensure fertility. This fundamental difference in the purpose of marriage meant that intimacy within marriage was viewed through a pragmatic, almost utilitarian lens. It was about procreation, perpetuating the family line, fulfilling social and economic obligations, and ensuring an heir rather than individual pleasure or emotional fulfillment. This stark reality would make modern dating apps, the concept of soulmates, and our emphasis on individual romantic compatibility utterly incomprehensible to a medieval person. Marriage was a duty, a contract, a cornerstone of society, not primarily a romantic endeavor. Public scrutiny and gossip. No secrets in a small world. In a world without privacy as we understand it, where homes were often single rooms housing multiple family members, where communities were tight-knit and isolated villages, and where legal and religious authorities were deeply intertwined with every aspect of daily life. Personal secrets, especially those concerning intimacy, sex, and family affairs, were almost impossible to keep. Gossip was a powerful social tool, a form of informal social control, and any deviation from perceived norms or moral codes would be quickly noticed, whispered about, and widely discussed, often leading to public shaming or ostracism. The constant surveillance was not just from official sources like the church with its prying confessors or legal courts with their public trials. It was from your neighbors, your family, your fellow villagers, and everyone else in your small, insular world. There were no anonymous urban spaces, no large cities where you could get lost in the crowd. Everyone knew everyone else's business. If you were having an affair, if your marriage was not producing children, a source of shame and suspicion, if your sexual practices were perceived as unnatural or sinful, if a woman was pregnant out of wedlock, or if a child was believed to be illegitimate, it would become common knowledge very quickly. This intense social pressure, the constant fear of public shaming, and the knowledge that your private life was essentially public domain, exerted immense control over individual behavior. There was no escaping the watchful eyes, the wagging tongues, and the harsh judgments of your community. This pervasive lack of anonymity and privacy would be deeply unsettling, even psychologically agonizing, for a modern individual accustomed to the freedom of personal space, the right to privacy, and the ability to keep their intimate lives truly private. It meant that every deviation from the norm carried a severe social penalty, making conformity paramount for survival and acceptance. The threat of social isolation was a powerful deterrent, forcing individuals to adhere to the rigid sexual and moral codes of the time, even when those codes felt unnatural or oppressive. It was a world where reputation was everything, and a single rumor could destroy a life. Fertility cults and pagan echoes, pre-Christian beliefs persist despite the overwhelming and increasingly dominant influence of Christianity, which became the official religion of most of Europe. Echoes of older pre-Christian fertility cults and pagan beliefs persisted stubbornly throughout the medieval period, particularly in rural areas, among the peasantry, and in remote regions where Christianization was less thorough. These ancient beliefs often manifested in rituals, charms, and practices intended to ensure bountiful harvests, healthy livestock, and crucially, human fertility. While outwardly Christian in their observances, many folk practices blended Christian saints and prayers with older, more primal beliefs in sympathetic magic and a deep reverence for nature's life-giving forces. For example, specific natural sites like ancient stones, sacred wells, or venerable trees might be believed to have fertility-enhancing properties, and barren women or couples struggling to conceive might secretly visit these sites or engage in specific rituals there, leaving offerings or performing symbolic acts. Phallic symbols, while explicitly condemned by the church as pagan, sometimes found their way into folk art, architectural carvings, often hidden from plain sight, or superstitions believed to bring good luck or aid conception and ward off evil. Maypole dances, which appear innocent today, often had ancient, pre-Christian fertility rites as their origin, symbolizing renewal, growth, and the generative power of nature. Specific plants, animals, or even certain moon phases were also associated with fertility in folk belief. These hidden or semi-hidden practices, often performed in secret or under the guise of Christian festivals, reveal that the deep human desire for fertility, the continuation of the family line, and the abundance of the land sometimes transcended strict Christian doctrine, blending seamlessly with older, more primal beliefs. It highlights the spiritual syncretism of the medieval period, where official Christian religion often coexisted with, and sometimes absorbed, or merely suppressed, deeply ingrained folk traditions and superstitions related to procreation, sexuality, and agricultural abundance. This constant interplay between the sacred and the profane, the old and the new, shaped the medieval mindset in profound and often contradictory ways, showing that ancient beliefs about fertility were remarkably resilient, even in the face of widespread Christianization. The role of bathhouses, pleasure, hygiene, and vice. Bathhouses in the medieval period, particularly in larger towns and bustling cities, were complex social spaces that served multiple functions. While they offered a rare and much-needed opportunity for communal hygiene, as we discussed, private, full-body bathing was a rare luxury for most. They were also often vibrant centers of recreation, socializing, and inevitably various forms of vice, including gambling, drinking, and prostitution. Many bathhouses were not strictly segregated by gender, or if they were, the partitions were easily circumvented or ignored. Men and women might mix in the communal bathing areas, leading to opportunities for flirtation, illicit encounters, and open sexual activity. These establishments could be raucous and sexually charged, a stark contrast to the piety and modesty preached by the church. As previously mentioned, some bathhouses were even owned and licensed by bishops, highlighting a fascinating institutional hypocrisy, where the church itself profited from places that facilitated what it publicly condemned as sin. In cities like London, where the famous stews of Southwark were controlled by the Bishop of Winchester, or Paris, these bathhouses, often called stews or bagnios, became notorious. They were frequented by travelers, merchants, and local citizens seeking both cleanliness and pleasure. The dual nature of bathhouses, as places of cleanliness and places of sin, reflects the persistent medieval tension between the body's physical needs and spiritual ideals. They were a practical necessity for basic hygiene in a dirty world, but also became undeniable hubs for the very activities the church sought to suppress. This provides a fascinating glimpse into the unofficial, underground sexual economy and social life that existed beneath the veneer of rigid moral codes, demonstrating that human desires for pleasure and connection, even illicit ones, found ways to manifest themselves in the most unexpected corners of medieval society. The prevalence and popular acceptance of these bathhouses, despite their morally ambiguous reputation, underscore the pragmatism and complex realities of medieval daily life. The pervasive fear of the devil and demonic influence on sex. For medieval people, the devil and his legions of demons were not abstract concepts or mere literary metaphors, They were terrifyingly real entities, constantly at work in the world, actively seeking to tempt humans into sin and drag their immortal souls to the eternal torments of hell. This pervasive existential fear of the demonic profoundly shaped their understanding of sexuality, particularly any acts deemed illicit, unnatural, or outside the strictures of church doctrine. Sexual temptation was often attributed directly to demonic influence. Lustful thoughts, illicit desires, or even vivid erotic nightmares could be seen as direct attacks or visitations from specific types of demons. Incubi, male demons believed to have sex with women in their sleep, often for nefarious purposes, draining their vitality or impregnating them with monstrous offspring. Or succubi, female demons who had sex with men in their sleep, similarly draining them or tempting them to sin. If a man experienced unexplained impotence, or a woman suffered from barrenness, or if a child was born with deformities, it could be blamed on a witch's curse fueled by demonic power, or direct demonic interference with conception. Confessors would routinely ask detailed questions about such encounters or temptations, probing for signs of demonic activity or a pact with evil. This belief system created an intensely terrifying internal landscape where one's own natural desires could be seen as evidence of demonic temptation, influence, or even outright possession, leading to immense psychological distress, fervent prayers, self-flagellation, or desperate attempts at exorcism. It turned intimacy into a spiritual battleground, where the immortal soul was constantly at risk of damnation. This deep-seated, all-encompassing fear of the demonic provided another powerful mechanism of social and religious control over sexual behavior, turning every illicit act into a direct pact with evil, a step closer to eternal hellfire, and a public sign of spiritual weakness or corruption. It added a layer of profound existential dread to every aspect of medieval sexuality, ensuring that pleasure was almost always intertwined with the potential for sin and spiritual peril. Courtly love, an idealized fantasy versus brutal reality. Comadon, the concept of courtly love, Finnemer in Aucassin, popularized in the elegant poetry, songs, and romances of the High Middle Ages, roughly 11th to 13th centuries, often involves a knight's idealized, often unrequited, devotion to a noble lady, frequently married and of higher social standing. This sophisticated romantic ideal, with its emphasis on chivalry, spiritual elevation through love, and often the sublimation of physical desire, stands in stark, almost brutal, contrast to the gritty, pragmatic realities of medieval marriage and sexuality we've explored. Courtly love was primarily a literary construct, an elaborate social game played by the elite within the aristocratic courts of Provence, France, England, and Germany, and rarely reflected the lived experience of ordinary people or the practicalities of feudal society. In courtly love, the emotional and spiritual connection was paramount. The love was often non-sexual, or at least platonic, and idealized, focusing on the knight's service, reverence, and profound adoration for the lady, rather than physical consummation. It often inverted traditional power dynamics, with the lady holding moral and emotional sway over her devoted knight, who strove to prove his worth through deeds of valor and poetic expression. However, this idealized concept sometimes served as a sophisticated mask or a subtle sublimation of actual illicit affairs within the court, offering a veneer of romantic respectability or a psychological outlet for desires that could not be openly expressed within the confines of arranged marriages. The line between idealized platonic love and genuine adultery in courtly circles was often deliberately blurred, creating a complex social dance. The vast discrepancy between the high-flown ideals of courtly love and the brutal, pragmatic reality of medieval marriage, which was about land, alliances, and heirs, and peasant sexuality, which was about survival and procreation, highlights the profound social and cultural chasm between the elite and the common people. While peasants were concerned with the daily grind of survival and the practical necessity of procreation, nobles sometimes indulged in complex, performative rituals of love and desire that had little to do with genuine affection, personal choice, or the legalities of marriage. This contrast further emphasizes how multi-layered and contradictory medieval sexual culture truly was, encompassing both the lofty aspirations of courtly romance and the base, often horrifying, realities of daily life for the vast majority. It illustrates that love itself had different meanings and context depending on one's social class and the specific cultural environment. The Graveyard of Privacy, a concluding thought on modern freedom. As you emerge from this immersive journey into the medieval world, perhaps feeling a profound sense of discomfort, mild nausea, and an overwhelming wave of relief, consider the ultimate legacy of these bizarre sexual practices and the complex laws, customs, and superstitions that governed them. They offer a rich, often uncomfortable, but always illuminating mirror through which to view our own societal norms, values, and anxieties concerning sexuality. They reveal the enduring human struggle to reconcile deep spiritual aspirations with primal bodily desires, the demands of social order with the yearning for individual freedom, and public morality with the messy realities of private lives. The concepts of individual autonomy over one's body, genuine consent beyond mere physical willingness, sexual orientation, gender identity, and diverse expressions of intimate identity that we cherish and increasingly fight for today would have been utterly incomprehensible, even heretical to the medieval mind. The academic discussion surrounding medieval sexuality often emphasizes this profound cultural relativity. It highlights that while the outward forms of expression, the governing moral frameworks, and the acceptable boundaries of intimacy have changed dramatically over the centuries, the underlying human experiences of love, lust, jealousy, shame, anxiety, and the profound desire for connection and intimacy remained fundamentally recognizable across the centuries. It's a compelling reminder that though the specifics evolve, the core drives and emotional complexities of humanity are surprisingly timeless. So, what is the ultimate legacy of these medieval sexual practices and the laws that govern them? They teach us that sexuality is always political, always dangerous, always intertwined with power, and always essential to human experience. The bizarre, often brutal, and frequently terrifying intimate practices of medieval people were their desperate, often ingenious, attempts to navigate these eternal tensions between desire and control, pleasure and danger, love and survival. Their struggles, their suffering, and their strange customs remind us that the quest for sexual freedom, for reproductive autonomy, and for authentic intimacy is not a modern invention, but an ancient human aspiration that transcends any particular historical moment, constantly being renegotiated within different societal contexts. As you drift off now, perhaps with a newfound visceral appreciation for modern plumbing, effective contraceptive methods, the sanctity of your private bedroom, accessible and effective medical care, and the freedom to define your own relationships, remember that the echoes of these medieval tensions and desires continue to resonate. They subtly shape our understanding of sexuality, morality, and the complex, often bizarre journey of human intimacy throughout history. Be profoundly grateful for modern medicine that doesn't require corpse parts or deadly potions, for legal systems that don't examine our bodies in public or punish us with public humiliation, for churches that don't own entertainment establishments, for doctors who understand anatomy beyond wandering wombs and two-seed theory, for contraception that won't kill us, for love based on mutual attraction rather than economic desperation and forced alliances, for adultery punishments that don't involve public torture or being paraded by a rope. The medieval world shows us the profound nightmare of intimacy without privacy or autonomy, but also the universality of human intimate nature, constantly seeking connection, satisfaction, and control over their destinies. People have always wanted pleasure, connection, and control over their fertility. They've always dealt with performance anxiety, relationship drama, societal judgment, and the bewildering complexities of desire. The medieval solutions were often publicly brutal and incredibly strange, but the underlying problems and desires were deeply, universally human. So, subscribe to see more disturbing historical truth that your teachers definitely didn't mention. Comment below. What single medieval practice from this journey shocked you the most, and what modern freedom related to intimacy do you now appreciate the most? Was it the capability examinations, the bishop entertainment empires, or the public shaming with ropes and rotten vegetables? Like if you're grateful for modern privacy and the beautiful fact that your intimate life is nobody's business but your own. And remember, however awkward your romantic life might be, at least you're not being led naked through town by your waist while neighbors throw literal human waste at you. History. It's rarely as neat or as pleasant as the textbooks want you to believe. Good night, and sleep tight.